Baltimore City Council Budget and Appropriations Committee. We're here today for Council Resolution 17-0003R, Quarterly Budget Briefing. I'm Councilman Eric Costello from the 11th District, Chair of the Committee, joined to my left by Councilman Leon Pinkett, 7th District, Chair of the Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To his left, Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer, 5th District, Member of the Committee. To my right, Councilwoman Shannon Sneed, 13th District, Member of the Committee. And to her right, Councilwoman Danielle McCray, 2nd District, Member of the Committee. We're also joined by Marguerite Curran to my immediate right, who is staff to the committee, Nina Themlis on behalf of Mayor Jack Young, Kaylin Young on behalf of Council President Brandon Scott. With that, Bob, take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Bob Senemy, Budget Director for the city, representing Department of Finance today, here to provide an update on the fiscal 20 outlook through the end of the second quarter. So just a reminder, this is an outlook through the end of the fiscal year based on data through the end of December for fiscal 20, and this is, of course, general fund only. Just first to provide an update on quarter to quarter. So when we were here at the first quarter, we had presented an outlook of a $4.6 million overall surplus. We're ramping that up. We have an improvement up to $26.4 million as our second quarter projection. And the biggest improvement there is on income tax and traffic cameras, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail. Not much side net overall on the expenditure side. I do want to acknowledge that we did have some data issues in the forecast in the first quarter, just some lingering ransomware issues. We think we're beyond that at this point, and I'll explain where we see those things and what the lingering impacts are of that. So first things first on the revenue side. So I'll go right to left here and explain what the big surplus is. This is not every revenue source. This is just the revenue sources where there's either a significant increase versus budget or a projected deficit versus the budgeted amount. And I'll explain each of these in a bit more detail. So first, on the far right, income tax. We're projecting a $26.2 million surplus versus a budget of $366 million. It's a significant improvement versus the first quarter. So at the time of the budget, we had assumed 2.1% growth from the fiscal 19 actual. And what we learned in the summer through discussing with our partners at the state is that the federal tax law that passed last year has led to greater receipts for both the state of Maryland and local jurisdictions. So we learned that in the summer. That was after the budget had already passed, and then we've gotten the confirmation that that is true more recently in the form of our November distribution. So November is when we get our first big cash payment from the state, and we can confirm now that we are doing better, much better because of that law. What the state has informed us of is that a lot more folks are now taking the standard deduction rather than being able to itemize deductions, which was a big change at the federal tax law. So that's the biggest reason why we're seeing more on that front. So on camera violations, on traffic cameras, if you remember, we kept the budget flat at about $21 million from fiscal 19 to fiscal 20. And the reason for that is because we were expecting behavior to eventually change and for the number of citations they were issuing to come down, and of course concurrently for the revenue to come down. And when we were here at the first quarter, I had testified that we thought that the camera program had peaked already, and I think that is still true on the number of citations. So what we've seen is that the number of citations peaked somewhere in the late spring or early summer of 2019. And what we've seen since then is that since that peak, the number of citations we've issued each month has come down slowly. So we peaked at the time that we finally got to 100 speed cameras and 100 red light cameras, which was the goal overall. Since that time, we've seen the citations dip a little bit. We have gotten confirmation from DOT that they will be moving some locations. So what we expect to see going forward is we might see little bumps in revenue as we move cameras and have some new locations coming. But I still think it's fair to say that the program has peaked at that point. One other thing that is helping us on the revenue side is that the collection rate is improved. So this is a change versus the first quarter. We're seeing a greater percentage of the citations we issued be paid. And we think that part of that is because you have to pay off local tickets before you re-register your vehicle. So as this program is longer in existence, more people are running into that situation where they have to pay something off before they re-register the vehicle. So we've seen an improvement in the collection rate. We're finally up to the 100 overall. We're starting to see that the number of citations decline a little bit, but that's still going to leave us, we believe, $9.3 million above the budget of about $21 million. So I think fiscal 20 will actually be our biggest year in terms of overall revenue for the program. The next item, personal property tax. This is same as what we reported last quarter, so surplus of $3.8 million. We had budgeted growth of 1% in this source, and the actual growth is about 4.5% for BGE on utility property and 6% for commercial. The $2.4 million for the local health operations grant. Remember, that was a ransomware issue. We have to provide some information to the state in order to receive that grant, and because we lost some information during the ransomware, we did not get that at the end of fiscal 19, so that is hitting. That's an additional payment that's hitting in fiscal 20. That's just a timing issue. It's $2.4 million. On hotel tax, we're projecting a surplus of $1.5 million versus the budget. We're seeing improvements in both the occupancy rate and the average daily rate, which is the average rate that a hotel charges for a room versus last year. We're up 1.5% on occupancy and a portion of a percent on the average daily rate. So both of those things are leading to better receipts there. And then on recordation and transfer, we're reporting a surplus of $1.1 million versus the budget of $79.9. Even though we have a surplus there, I just want to note that this is well below the actual that we recorded in fiscal 2019. And the reason for that is even though the volume of transactions we're seeing is higher on both transfer and recordation, the average value per transaction is much lower. And we've been trying to figure out what that is. I don't have a good answer for that yet, but we are seeing lower value per transaction across both transfer and recordation. And I think just going forward, what this means for us is that really our budget has now essentially caught up with the actuals, because we've always budgeted based on a 5-year moving average. The reason for that was so we didn't get ahead of ourselves and budget too much, given that this source is so volatile. But really now the budget has basically about caught up with what we've seen over the last 5 years. We can't expect to see significant surplus in this line item going forward. We have seen huge surpluses in transfer and recordation over the last few years, sometimes in the tens of millions of dollars. We probably won't see that going forward. Minus, some huge increase in the activity in the housing market. Moving to the items where we have deficits, all of these we reported last period. So parking revenues, we have a deficit of $2.8 million. So the way that works is all of our parking revenues first go off to pay enforcement expenses and garage expenses, and then the net proceeds is transferred into the general fund. So we're expecting a $2.8 million less of a transfer into the general fund than projected at budgeted. That includes parking fines, that includes garage income, and that includes parking tax revenues. And like I think I've shared with this group before, we're seeing declines across the board pretty consistently on all those revenue sources, which we believe is because of less activity for those, especially on personal vehicles. The things that we have done to try to offset that trend is, one was we had got the taxi tax expansion passed for Uber and Lyft. So I know that has passed the council. I believe it's just awaiting the mayor's signature, so that should go into effect soon. That will help offset some of this decline. We also have a pilot underway with DOT to add. We've authorized them to add people on their residential parking enforcement. So one of the complaints we've gotten from DOT and from residents over time is that there are certain areas of the city that are just not enforced in terms of parking restrictions. They have confirmed for us that they have 13 of those folks out on the street, and that just as of January that they're seeing an increase in the number of citations issued. That's not included here, but I think that over the course of the rest of the year we'll see a bump up at least in the number of citations issued for that type of enforcement. And then the last two items are tax credits, so the brownfields and the high performance. So the challenge on these two has been that when we build the budget, there are some projects that are in the mix that will be getting the credit in the next year that they don't have an occupancy permit yet. So when those come online, we see both a credit on they receive the property tax credit, but there's also net property tax that comes online at the same time. So For the brownfields in particular, we had properties in which the assessed value grew year over year, so we're giving more of a credit. Again, the assessment is built in on the revenue side for property tax, but it looks like a larger credit. It is a larger credit for those properties. And on the high performance, it's the same thing. It's a smaller number, but there's 2 brand new projects that came online this year, 414 Light and 611 South Charles. And there was also 2 others where the credit was granted at the end of fiscal 19, but we did not have that in the budget. And so the net effect of that is we're seeing larger costs for those property tax credits. Again, the net income comes on the property tax side, but it is more lost revenue from the perspective of this line item. So those are the large changes on the revenue side. And then on the expenditure side, I wanted to touch on the big agencies where we either have a deficit or a surplus or something else of note. So on police, we're projecting a $3.4 million deficit. This is an improvement versus what we shared in the first quarter. This assumes that they would spend about $1.5 million per pay period of overtime through the end of the year. They want to note again that they've done a much better job on managing their overtime. Even if you just look the first 6 months of fiscal 20 versus the first 6 months of fiscal 19, they've spent $4 million less year to date through January on overtime, which is great. And what we've seen is after a level of around $2 million for the first few pay periods of the year, once they put their accountability measures in place internal, we've seen them be right around the 1.4, 1.5 million per pay period consistently. So if they can keep that up, I think they'll be on pace to get within budget. They're going to be close. So we're projecting them just to be safe at a small deficit, but if we need a supplemental, we'll of course talk about that at the third quarter and come with that information then. On the fire department, there's also an improvement here versus the first quarter projection. We're projecting a $1.9 million deficit. There were 2 things here that have helped. One is more of a technical adjustment. One is something in practice that's helping. On the technical side, there was an error, we think, in our first quarter data where we overstated the cost for fleet and facilities repairs. That was, again, related to ransomware, so that was a mistake on the projection. So we've corrected that. One thing that they have improved on the overtime side is they've been working with BBMR, actually Daniel in particular, to try to fill terminal leave vacancies right away. So what the practice was before was if they had a vacancy where somebody was due to retire, the fire department personnel per their contract can take a leave off before they actually formally retire, up to 11 months in some cases. And what was happening was they were leaving those positions vacant. They had a backfill with other personnel. And then once they hired somebody new, they still had to go through the academy and the training to get back on the force. So what we said was if you have somebody that's going to retire, even if they have a time off, you should be trying to backfill that position earlier, right away. It's a net savings for the city, and they have taken that practice and they're running with it. So they've been more aggressive about hiring for those positions right away, and that has reduced their overtime costs. On one other agency that we didn't report on at the first quarter, so Public Works has a campaign underway, the Clean It Up campaign, and we think there are some places where this could be a bit more costly than expected. So first off, they are doing some overtime work to try to address a backlog of cleaning requests, and they're also using contractors to assist with that work. So there's an effort underway to try to get the backlog of cleaning requests that are outstanding down to 0 in the spring. One other issue is that the Northwest Transfer Station, so because we're trying to allow for more small haulers to drop their materials off at that particular location, there are some of our own vehicles that have longer route times to get to Bresco. So there could be some overtime cost or fuel and maintenance costs related to that. And then there was, again, ransomware related, there was a missed payment to Bresco. So the city pays Bresco for the volume of things that we bring to Bresco. There was a missed payment in fiscal 19, and that has to be charged in fiscal 20. So it just was because of the being down on the systems, that's going to hit in fiscal 2020. It should have hit in fiscal 2019. So again, the campaign is meant to be a short-term kind of get through the backlog. So we're building in some of those incremental costs here. We'll again report on the third quarter. If we think we'll need a supplemental, we'll report back at that point. And then debt service, no change versus the first quarter, is that we expect $6 million of surplus, and this is again the timing of borrowing and debt payments. We always borrow for, we always project or account for in the budget a full year of timing on our debt service payments, but it just depends on when the borrowing happens on either the TIF projects or our general obligation bond. So we're always safe here, so we've generally had surplus here just in case we have to borrow more earlier in the fiscal year. And then one other issue that touches many agencies is that in the fiscal 20 budget, we included 2% COLAs for MAPS and AFSCME and CUB. AFSCME ended up settling for 3%, and there were also some pay adjustments for harder to fill positions for laborer and driver positions. And then MAPS settled for 2.5%, and then CUB is still in progress, although we should be wrapped up shortly. And the net cost of all those two is $3 million throughout the entire city. And again, that will hit different agencies. A lot of that will hit DPW, DOT, and DGS. Just one other comment before we close and get to questions. There's two, I think, wild cards for the 2020 projection. One is the snow season, and I don't want to jinx it, but we've had nothing. We've had one activation, really. So, one big storm can easily add $6, $8, $10 million very quickly. But at this point, to be safe, we're projecting that budget fully spent. But even one big storm could blow through that really quickly. And also, we're keeping our eye on the coronavirus. So there's a lot of news that we've seen in the past week or so that there has been, the stock market has declined. There's a lot of jitters in the market and the global markets. We haven't seen any impact of that yet, but it seems more and more as it progresses that there's likely to be, some impact in the United States. And setting the health issues aside, of course, which I'm not, which I can't speak to in much detail, that could have an impact economically on the city. If there's less travel, you could have less hotel tax. If there's a slowdown in the global economy, you could see slowdown in income tax receipts. I'm being very premature here, but we're just keeping our eye on it because it does seem to be having an impact, at least in the short term, on the global marketplace. So with that, I'll pause and I can take any questions.
Thank you. We've been joined by Council Vice President Sharon Green Middleton from the 6th District, member of the committee, and Councilman Bill Henry from the 4th District, member of the committee. Bob, last quarter, you guys had indicated there was a projected transportation surplus of $4.9 million and health department surplus of $3.4 million. Are we still on track for that? So, notwithstanding the two previous issues you just discussed, snow as DOT and coronavirus.
Transportation, no. Again, we're fully, that even includes us projecting snow fully at budget. Health, there are a couple of agencies that have smaller surpluses if they're under $1 million. So generally health and DGS are the ones that have small surpluses because of vacancies, but those numbers have both come down.
Got it. On slide 4, the last bullet under the police department, rental of motor vehicles is currently projected at $2.1 million deficit.
Right.
BPD currently undergoing vehicle audit to identify inefficiencies. Do we know who's conducting that audit and what the status of it is?
So I know they're working with the city stat team to do this. So the process has generally been their goal, or what they're trying to achieve, is if they have rental of outside vehicles, they'd like to replace those with city vehicles. And their reasoning for that is that if they have folks out on the street, they'd rather have a police car just to show that there's presence, rather than having an unmarked car. So they do have some that are rentals. So we're trying to figure out how to do that in a cost-neutral way. We're not there yet. So what we first asked them is that we need to see kind of where all the vehicles are to make sure that there's not savings there. That's underway. That's in process. Daniel's actually been representing us on that team, and they're working with City Stat and us. But we do have high cost in that particular line item that we think we can correct if we go through this audit and get a little bit better information from them.
Do you have anything to add, or that's good?
Just that they're also working with the Civic Innovators Group, so that's that group that the mayor's office pulled together of private sector individuals. They're going to make a recommendation about fleet size. They're also making some recommendations about when we should start replacing vehicles as opposed to fixing them. So we're working with them to try to put all of that package together so that we can do it in a budget neutral way. I think all of our goals collectively is to stop renting cars and to put more police vehicles out on the street.
What's the time frame or estimated time frame for completion?
We're hoping to get something finalized over the summer, so it probably will not end up in this year's budget, but that's something we can do within police's appropriation next year.
Thank you. Vice President Middleton?
Thank you. On page 3, where you talked about the camera violation, and you had mentioned that you were in the process of moving cameras around.
Right.
I don't know if this is a problem in any other district, but so I have a major elementary middle school, Martin Luther King, and the children are being it's closing, so the children are the elementary people are being dispersed to Edgecombe Circle, which is one route, and the middle school is being dispersed to Pimlico Elementary Middle. So if you know a little bit about Cold Spring, Green Spring, all that area, so there's new walking routes being developed. And I learned from the last community meeting that there seems to be a disconnect with the school system and the other agencies, especially with the transportation department, in trying to get information to them in a timely manner for things like movement of the red light cameras and speed cameras. And it's crucial that they communicate, because cameras now are going to be needed like in different routes and locations for walkable routes. So I don't know if your office is connected to be aware of those things as you decide where those cameras are going to go.
Yeah, we don't have, we defer to DOT on the location decision. I mean, we really look at more of the data and kind of the financial impact. What they have told us is if they see, the ones that they're planning to move would be if they see a camera that dips below a certain threshold, which to them would represent that the behavior changes happened at that location. And then what they've told us is that they have other locations in mind that they can move them to, that either have come in through a request, or that they have or that their data shows that there's other, accidents at that intersection or that area that they would move them to. But we don't play a direct role in the actual location, so I would have to defer to DOT on that.
Okay.
On that piece of it.
Please let them know that you're aware, and
We will.
because there's going to start to be protests forming of a certain intersection.
Okay.
Councilman Schleifer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the on this public works? So as far as the Clean It Up campaign, you were talking about we're using private contractors to get it done by a specific date. How much money are we going to be spending on private contractors?
So I don't have that figure. I can send you the exact amount, but what we're doing is, what the city is doing is they're using some of our own personnel, and in some cases on overtime, to work on that backlog on different shifts. They're also using so we have a contractor that generally does some cleaning and proactive mowing. And so if there are certain lots or areas that need to be cleaned that fit that criteria, we're using that contractor to help with those. So I don't have in front of me the breakdown of both of those, but we can send it to you as a follow-up. We're using both of them.
Yeah, if you could send it to me, because I'm curious. So what is the date? When is this going until?
So I think it's through the spring. I think there's some date in the spring. They're trying to get the backlog down. I think they had said April originally, or May. We'll get you the exact.
Gotcha. So there's just an artificial date created to complete the backlog of 311 requests that we've probably had since 311 was created. And so I'm just curious, just as far as cost efficiency is concerned, right? So if and trust me, we all want the city to be cleaned up, so we applaud that that's happening, but we have crews that are on salary to be doing this work. Right. And sometimes they need to be paid overtime for overtime work, and we understand that. The private contractors is a piece that stuck out to me, because then whatever this artificial date would be, whether it's sometime in the spring, so April 1st, April 28th, whatever it may be, then the next day, if let's say all of these requests are cleared out, then we have these crews that are on salary already. Are we going to be paying for this extra money up front for the contractors, and then also not have our crews working at full capacity from that next day moving forward, say April 29th moving forward.
Yeah, so my understanding is what we're trying to achieve is a point where we get new service requests all the time. So we're trying to get to a point where we can handle, or best we can handle, closer to the volume that we typically get in a normal weekly or monthly period. And so what has happened is, because a backlog has grown over time, we haven't been able to keep up with the new stuff that gets reported. So the idea is you do kind of a one-time work to kind of get it down, but then going forward, the core resources that we have, our own resources out for street and alley cleaning, are still going to be needed to keep up with the new ones that come up at that point. I don't have the data on how many requests we get per month and if that's enough. I mean, presumably that backlog has built up over a long period of time. But the complaint has been that sometimes new ones don't get cleaned up right away because we're still working on other requests. So the idea would be to kind of get the backlog down as close as we can to zero.
Right, so that data is pretty important for us to just get an understanding of budgetary-wise, because if that number of new requests per day is less than how many they can do, then that means whatever the next day after we get to zero, whatever that next day is, we're going to have crews that are working, that are being paid, but don't have enough things to do. And if the number is greater and every day more requests are coming in, even if we started at zero today,
Right.
and we started from that first one and started working through, if the number is greater, then that means that we have a fundamental problem here that we need to actually address more long-term, and maybe the solution isn't to pay private contractors, whoever they are, to come in and clean this stuff up, but rather hire additional employees in the long term for DPW to make sure that we're right-sized. And so
Right.
that's, I guess, the question that I'll wait to get the answer as far as the,
Yeah.
the numbers.
DPW's been, and city stat have been tracking this pretty closely, so we can provide just a schedule of what the plan is, for sure.
Yeah, that'd be great to know. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I just add to that dialogue of this particular subject? So Councilman, just for both of you to add that I know for a fact as well that DPW has other things that they have also added in with the plan that they're doing, like they have partnered with certain communities because of extra grant funding to also work with cleanup, and they also have apprenticeship plans in place to train for to get jobs with DPW as well. So it's like 3 or 4 other things that are working along with this pilot haulers program as well. So I think they're kind of doing everything, helping outside contractors, trying to gain employees for the training to get employees for themselves, and it's just several things that are working together within a certain time period. I just wanted to kind of add that.
I guess I'll take this opportunity to add my 2 cents before I go to Councilman Pinkett. My view on this is that the significant backlog we have was caused in large part due to the previous administration and the lopsided nature of the VRI initiative and the strains that put on solid waste along with other operational divisions within agencies. I know that this administration has made significant progress in reducing that backlog. As far as I'm concerned, as long as we have a projected surplus that is healthy, I'm all in favor of using those funds to bring on contractor support to support the great folks that we have at DPW to minimize that backlog as quickly as humanly possible so that we can get back to a stabilized position where we're not required to pay overtime, something that's more fiscally sustainable. I don't know if I'm saying something that's in between what the two of you just said, but I just figured I'd throw out my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Because I had the opportunity. So, Councilman Pinkett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of dovetailing off what you just mentioned. Bob, how much is a crew?
About like $500,000 for salaries, equipment, vehicle, 400,000 to 500,000 roughly.
So essentially, we could almost have 4 additional crews for the amount of money that we spent for the,
Right.
see, I mean, that's really where the issue is for me. Like, the amount of money that you spent to kind of get us to an equilibrium could have been spent to put 4 additional crews that are there for the entire year.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were, just to note, there were additional crews added in the budget, the prior administration for the VRI initiatives particularly. I mean, one of the challenges still been to kind of get personnel into those slots that they can,
No, I get
that
it.
will stay. And so you know, speaking for DPW here, I mean, they try to recruit and get into those positions, but again, they do rely sometimes on contracts or overtime if they can't keep positions filled for those particular crews. So our preference would be to have people in those slots and just be doing that so we don't have to spend on overtime or use a contract.
Right.
But there are some times when they need to do that.
And how many people make up a typical crew?
I'm not sure. Is it 3? Three?
No, I'm just, it just seems like in a city with the unemployment rate that we have, I think we could find 15 people. You know, just a thought.
Yep.
I guess my next question is more of a statement than a question. So when we look at especially when we look at the high performance market rate rental tax credit, and I may have asked this before, but like, is there another figure? Because if we look at the credits from this perspective, to me, they're always going to look bad, and without having something else that shows, you know, what the benefit or what revenue we are getting as a result of the credit.
And I remember this came up at the last hearing. Yeah, so I mean, the way I think of it is we have a line item in our budget just for each individual credit, and then we have a big line item for property tax revenue as a whole. So when one of these projects comes online, there is additional property tax revenue, and then a certain amount of it is credited out because of the tax credit. So the reason you'll see deficits in these line items is that if we had projects that happen to come up either at the end of the spring after the budget is already passed, or in the beginning of the year or during the year where we don't have any information, then they show up as credits in the budget, or I'm sorry, in the actuals.
Okay.
But those programs come, of course, I mean, those come with property tax revenue, of course.
Yes.
The first year for the high performance, it's an 80% credit, and then it phases out over time. So there is property tax revenue built in when these projects, of course, come online. But yeah, the cost of these credits has grown because we have more units that are more properties that are getting the credit.
Right, and if, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be a part of, you know, these hearings, but I mean, for my benefit, it would benefit me to see another slide that just shows the, you know, for example, the high performance credit to show, you know, the revenues that are being generated by that.
There's assessment value that's in the.
So we can at least, you know, get a sense that this credit is actually working, because I just don't want people to look at it and see a deficit and be like, is this?
I mean, we have a list of all the properties that are getting it. I mean, we could put in the assessed value just so you can see it side by side, if that would be helpful.
Okay.
On both of these. There's fewer of the high performance. The brownfield, a lot of the properties are, you know, there's residential properties that get the brownfield. People think of it as like a commercial program, but there are some residential properties that are getting the credit as well. But we have the list of addresses that we can share with you with the assessed value.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah, we have the list. We'll just add the assessed value so you can
Yes.
see what the total.
Okay, no,
total
that'd be great. And lastly, just real quick, even with the success that we're having with the reduction in overtime costs, you still think that we might have a supplemental coming?
I mean, I think we're going to be really close. I think we're going to have to decide at the end of the third quarter if they can keep on their pace of being in that $1.4, $1.5 million range. I think we'll be able to do without a supplemental this year. I want to see a couple more months of data. I want to wait until the third quarter.
Okay.
You know, I can say, you know, the accountability measures they put in place are working. They're doing really well. I also want to leave a little wiggle room. Sometimes there's just times when there's a direction to put more folks on the street, or for a certain issue that's happening, if there's a spate of violence or something. So we've seen consistently they've been in that level, 1.4, 1.5. You know, it's very consistent now since those accountability measures were in place. But they'd have to hit that every pay period through the rest of the year. And sometimes there's things that might be out of their control.
Okay.
Or there might be a directive to kind of, put more bodies on the street.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Couple quick clarifications on his request before we get to Councilwoman Sneed and then Vice President Middleton.
And
I didn't know you had a question, sir.
Councilman
My fault,
Fink
you
had
must have-
passed
you
it.
just must
Oh,
not have
I
heard me.
apologize. You submitted that a while ago?
Yeah.
Okay. Councilwoman Sneed and Council Vice President Middleton, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go to Councilman Henry first. On the high performance market rate, can you get us a spreadsheet and identify address, year brought online, year that they are in the credit, which is really just subtracting the current year from the year that they were brought online, and the assessment of the property, what they should be paying versus what they are paying,
Yeah, we
and
can-
just sum that up.
We can do that pretty.
That would be fantastic if you could send that to me. Second item, on the surplus for income taxes,
Yes.
which looks pretty healthy this year. God bless. Do we have any information on income taxes specifically from properties that were recipients of the newly constructed dwelling tax credit?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I've asked that before, and I don't think
we've
anyone
had-
has an answer, but I'm just
Yeah,
asking again.
we don't. We've been having a good conversation internally just about with BDC and HCD and planning about tax credits and what we should be assuming. I mean, and Live Baltimore too has been part of those. So they will report sometimes that they have data that in some of the new properties or when people move that they came from outside of the city, but it's survey data, so it's hard to kind of verify the accuracy of it. But they do have some reason to believe that some of the people that live in these buildings or any new construction really came from outside of the city. Some of them are likely moving from other parts of the city, of course. So I don't have any. I can't say that we have any really sound data that we collectively as a city can say for sure that these are the people that have moved here from elsewhere and these are the people that were just choosing that had already decided they're going to live here. But we're having a conversation about that now internally. There's a lot of good discussion. We actually got some data from Live Baltimore the other day about what they're seeing on their end, but there's nothing that you can really point to that can prove it, so to speak. We haven't been able to put all the pieces together to prove it.
From my perspective as someone who consistently advocates for economic development incentives, recognizing that that is usually contradicting odds with your division within finance, actually virtually always, in all fairness. I'm frustrated with the city in general, and it's not just this administration, it's since I've gotten on the council 5.5 years ago, with our ability to measure progress associated with these. For example, during Port Covington, we had, and you'll recall this from your time with the Rawlings-Blake administration, we had a list from Baltimore Development Corporation of all pilots that had been issued in TIFs. Yeah. And interestingly enough, there were a lot of political arguments made against why that was a bad idea, Port Covington. And one of the things that we were able to quantify very clearly was that the most successful TIF the city had done in terms of revenue generated and jobs created was Mondawmin Mall. So I think that we need to do a better job of aggregating that information and putting it into a digestible format for council members and decision makers within the administration before we're coming to request extensions of existing authority on credits and individual one-off entitlements such as a TIF or a pilot.
Yeah.
So anyway, I would urge finance to take the lead in that.
Yeah. I think our interest in this is, we're pro-development because it helps the city. It brings in more money. We're pro-development up until, we don't want to give away any more money in tax credits than we have to. And so I think part of the challenge is, part of that could be either through the application process or requiring the developer to provide some data back to the city or having some way to track the data to see if it's worked. So We have an interest in that as well. It's something, again, like I said, we've been discussing it internally to figure out. And some of that could be changes to the legislation requiring more information or requiring some kind of test or something up front. So I think we have the same interest there to make sure that we know what the results of those.
Sure. I think of 414 Light Street in my district. When that reaches full maturity, I guess you call it net present value or current day dollars, that property alone is going to generate $7.25 million a year to the general fund. And so when we're talking about, that covers
Yeah.
a snowstorm, right?
Yeah, and it's also, trying to figure out, and we've actually started looking at this, seeing the occupancy and seeing if they really do ultimately fill up, because the other side of that could be that if it doesn't fill up all the way, the assessed value could fall at the end of the credit when it goes back when it's due. So we're trying to put all those pieces together. It's I have a heavy interest in this. I've been spending a lot of time on this. It's complicated, I can tell you. So we've taken the step of, at least internally, making sure we get the perspective of HCD and BDC and planning and Lib Baltimore and try to put the pieces together and see if there's a better way to do it.
I certainly appreciate the complexity of it and the mutual nerdy interest in it that you and I share, and hope that you all continue to pursue that. One housekeeping item, and then to Councilman Henry. Moving forward for these quarterlies and starting with the quarter 3, which we'll do in mid-May, I'd like to have a representative from each of the agencies that have a projected deficit for the end of the year, for the end of the fiscal year, in excess of $1 million. So just based off of this presentation, that would be someone from police, fire, and public works.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I think that.
We don't need the director, the fire chief, or the commissioner here. I think we're talking about one person on the financial side, the CFO or equivalent, and one person who's deputy director. I'm thinking for DPW, it would be appropriate to have the CFO and John Chalmers. For fire, CFO, and a deputy commissioner, police, Jim Gillis and the CFO, something along those lines.
We have done that occasionally in the past.
We
If
have,
there's-
and I've asked you not to,
Yeah.
and so you guys have been fantastic and have done everything we've asked. So thank you for that. Moving forward, could you take the lead in alerting Nina and the government relations team that, hey, these are the 3 or 4 agencies that are having a projected end-of-year deficit in excess of $1 million. And Nina, if your team could make sure the right folks, based on and you know who all those right folks are, that they're here.
Yeah, when we come at the third quarter, when we come at the third quarter, we'll ask at the same time that we'll tell you that we're putting a supplemental forward too, to give you the awareness if that's what's needed. So we'll definitely do that.
Great, because I just feel like John Chalmers is better positioned to answer the councilman's questions about number of folks in a crew. There's someone at police department that knows more about the fleet than you guys do. That's not your fault. We just want to have the right people here. Councilman Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just so that you don't feel that the council is all stick and no carrot, I'm sure we'll be sending candy and flowers to agency heads who have a projected surplus. Okay. My question was actually pretty quick. My recollection from what I'd heard of the Clean It Up campaign was there were also going to be enhanced code enforcement efforts as part of that. It was unclear whether that was coming from filling vacancies in code enforcement officers or also doing overtime for code enforcement officers, but the point was that there was going to be a lot more code enforcement as part of the campaign. And my question was, do you have projected revenue coming in as enhanced from that would offset any of these potential surplus costs? I'm sorry, potential deficit costs.
No in the current projection, but we'll follow up on that and see what the status was. We've been focusing mostly on DPW. Some of that gets done by HCD, so.
Do you know if the enhanced code enforcement is coming from more code enforcement officers or the ones who are there working more?
I think it's the latter, but let me confirm that with them.
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Sneed.
just have a question in reference to the transfer stations. I know the mayor's office is doing a pilot now in reference to letting folks just go to, I think, 2 locations instead of just 1 location. And so if that does well, where we see less dumping throughout the city, is that something that's going to be added to the budget next year?
Yeah, it could be. We have to wait to evaluate to see. I doubt it will make it into the 21 budget just because we're only about a month away from putting the preliminary budget out there. So we'd want to see the results of the pilot through the spring first. And so you probably won't see anything in the 2021 budget, but when the pilot is done, we might come back with, a recommendation on how to either to expand it or to stop it if it's not working.
And then I'm curious for the second question in reference to zero waste and making sure that we are actually looking at different options to maybe save, and as far as like educating our constituents and just doing things differently. Have we ever considered some of those options?
So are there particular ones that you're thinking
Like
of?
Composting, recycling, like really going after a real.
Yeah, I'll be blunt about this one. We need to get better I think we need to get that message to DPW and planning, because I do think that there could be savings on some of these. I think a lot of the conversation I see about it assumes that there are savings, but we have to put all the pieces together and make sure that's true. Like, for example, on recycling is better. We know that recycling is better, but at the moment we're actually paying more in some cases because the contract, the global market has changed, and we pay more to dispose of recycling. So I think a lot of the stuff I see generally about like, oh, there's savings if we compost or recycling might not necessarily be true from the city's perspective. That doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do or the right way to go. And so I've been pretty blunt with DPW and planning to have them thinking about, they need to think a little bit more about the city's financial perspective, and we can help with that, of course. But I see a lot of things floating around that assume things are savings for the city that's not necessarily the case. So, if you have specific, situations or you want to talk about them separately, I'd be happy to talk about those, because I do see a little bit of misinformation sometime out there about those kind of things.
Council Vice President Middleton.
Thank you, Councilwoman Sneed. Good question. My recommendation would be hopeful that the data will show that we need our extra trash day back. But my question is, and I don't know if you answered this, but the local health operations grant, what exactly does that cover?
So it's a grant that we get from the state. It actually goes to the general fund because it just covers a broad range of health services. So we treat it as a general fund revenue source. But in order to get it, you get a quarterly payment from the state, and in order to get that money, you have to report on certain items, and we weren't able to report in time last year because of the ransomware. But it goes to the general fund because it's broad enough to cover a range of health services.
Okay.
Colleagues, any other question? Oh, Councilman Henry.
Would it be possible for, I'm sorry, let me preface this with I understand that the Budget Bureau has asked each agency to provide a budget request that includes a 5% cut.
For fiscal 21.
For fiscal 21.
For fiscal 21 and 22, 2-year.
Is it the expectation that we will discuss those as part of the third quarter conversation, or should we set up an extra opportunity for the committee to go through those requests? Because, Mr. Chair, I would think that it would be very informative for the committee to see what the agencies themselves were willing to cut before we have our actual budget hearings later in the spring to see what actually did get cut.
Yeah, so I think it probably wouldn't be appropriate for the third quarter hearing since we're focusing on fiscal 20, and this is forward looking. The reduction targets that were asked of the agencies is for 21 and 22, and part of that is in the context of Kerwin.
So a separate conversation would probably be more appropriate.
I think so. And you know, I want to make sure we check back with the administration. Some of those, discussions are, pre-decisional. Some of those, and you'll see some of those things in the fiscal 21 budget. We'll give you a flavor of some of the other things that we're thinking of in preparation for Kerwin. I don't see why we can't share some information. I just want to make sure we check back because some of those are sensitive conversations, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Colleagues, any other questions? Okay, we are now in recess. Thank you.
Thank you.